Welcome to the DX Today podcast, your weekly deep dive into the AI ecosystem. I'm Rick Spair, and joining me as always is Laura.
Thanks, Rick. And what a week it has been in the world of artificial intelligence, especially when it comes to how AI is fundamentally reshaping the workforce and the jobs landscape across multiple industries.
That is exactly what we are diving into today, because the numbers coming out of the first quarter of 2026 are absolutely staggering, and they tell a story that goes way beyond simple headlines about layoffs.
You are so right about that. And let me start with the big number that everyone is talking about this week, which is that 345,000 jobs were eliminated in the first quarter of 2026 alone. And these cuts span well beyond the technology sector.
345,000 jobs in just 3 months is a massive number. And what really stands out to me is that these are not recession-driven layoffs from companies that are struggling financially or trying to cut costs to survive.
Exactly. And that is the critical distinction that makes this moment so different from previous waves of layoffs we have seen in the past decade. Because the companies doing the cutting are profitable and cash-rich, including names like Oracle, Amazon, UPS, Morgan Stanley, and even Porsche and Heineken.
So when you see companies like Porsche and Heineken on that list, it really drives home the point that this is not just a Silicon Valley phenomenon anymore, because AI-driven workforce restructuring is hitting manufacturing, finance, beverages, and consumer electronics all at once.
The tech sector alone is losing about 900 jobs per day, according to the latest tracking data. But what is really fascinating is how the conversation has shifted from whether AI will displace jobs to how fast this transformation is actually happening and whether society is ready for it.
That shift in the conversation is something I have been watching closely, and I think the Washington Post really captured it well with their new interactive tool that maps AI vulnerability across more than 350 different occupations in the United States.
That Washington Post tool is remarkable because it uses detailed task-level analysis to estimate how much of each job can be performed more efficiently by artificial intelligence, and the results are both illuminating and a little bit unsettling for a lot of workers.
What are some of the occupations that show up as most vulnerable in that analysis? Because I imagine it goes beyond the obvious candidates like data entry clerks and customer service representatives that people usually think of first.
You would be right about that, because the highest vulnerability scores show up in computer programming, marketing, financial analysis, and customer service. But there are also surprising entries like interpreters and translators who face a 49% automation exposure rate, according to the data.
That is fascinating and also a bit sobering, but I want to dig into something that really jumped out at me from the research, which is the gender disparity in who is most affected by these changes in the workforce.
This is one of the most important findings that is not getting nearly enough attention. And the data shows that women make up approximately 86% of the workers in the most vulnerable occupations, which means the negative effects of AI automation are not going to be distributed equally across society.
86% is an enormous disproportion, and it raises really serious questions about whether the transition programs and reskilling initiatives that companies and governments are putting together are adequately addressing the specific needs of the populations most affected.
Absolutely. And this connects directly to another major trend we are seeing, which is Gartner's prediction that 20% of organizations will use AI to completely flatten their organizational structures by the end of 2026, eliminating more than half of their current middle management positions.
The middle management story is one that I think a lot of people in corporate America are not fully appreciating yet, because when you think about what middle managers actually do day to day, a huge portion of it is scheduling, reporting, performance monitoring, and information routing.
Those are exactly the kinds of tasks that AI systems can handle with increasing efficiency. And the data shows that companies are already automating scheduling, performance tracking, report generation, and even some decision-making processes that used to require a human supervisor in the loop.
So if you are a middle manager right now and you are hearing this, the question is not whether AI will affect your role, but how quickly your organization is going to make that transition and what you should be doing right now to prepare for it.
And here's where the story gets more nuanced and actually somewhat optimistic. Because the same research from the World Economic Forum that projects massive disruption also projects that 170 million new positions will be created globally by 2030.
So you are saying that even though 92 million jobs are projected to be displaced, the net effect is actually a positive 78 million new jobs, which is a very different narrative than the doom and gloom headlines might suggest.
Exactly right. And the key question becomes what those new jobs look like and who is positioned to fill them. Because the World Economic Forum also reports that employers expect 39% of workers' core skills to change fundamentally by the end of this decade.
That is a massive skills transformation. And it makes me wonder how companies are actually responding to this challenge in practical terms. Because knowing that skills need to change is very different from actually making that change happen at scale.
The data on that is actually quite encouraging in some ways because 85% of employers surveyed by the World Economic Forum say they plan to prioritize workforce upskilling through 2030. And we are seeing real investment flowing into training programs and internal AI academies.
But there is a gap between planning to upskill and actually doing it effectively. And I imagine the numbers on how many workers actually need reskilling versus how many are receiving it paint a somewhat different picture of where things stand today.
You are absolutely right to push on that because the estimates suggest that approximately 120 million workers globally face medium-term redundancy without significant reskilling. And that is a massive number that current training programs are not yet equipped to handle at the necessary scale.
120 million workers facing redundancy without reskilling is a number that should keep policymakers up at night. And it really underscores why the AI skills wage premium has become such a powerful economic signal in the labor market.
The wage premium data from PwC's Global AI Jobs Barometer is stunning because workers who have developed advanced AI skills are now earning 56% more than their peers in identical roles who lack those skills, which is one of the largest skill-based wage premiums we have ever measured.
56% more for the same job title just because you have AI skills is an incredible incentive. And it really tells you where the labor market is placing its bets on what capabilities are going to matter most going forward.
And that wage premium is being driven by real productivity gains, not just hype, because the data shows that productivity growth has nearly quadrupled in AI-exposed industries since 2022, which means companies are getting measurable returns on their AI investments in human capital.
Let me push back on something, though, because there is a growing concern that we are creating a two-tier workforce where AI-skilled workers thrive and everyone else gets left behind. And that seems like a recipe for significant social and economic tension.
That is a completely valid concern, and it is one that several researchers and policy organizations have flagged, because if the benefits of AI accrue primarily to those who are already educated and technologically literate, we could see existing inequality gaps widen rather than narrow.
And this is where the new roles that are emerging become really interesting because some of them, like AI ethics officer and AI prompt engineer, did not even exist a few years ago. And they represent entirely new career pathways that could potentially be accessible to a broader population.
The new role creation is fascinating. And Gartner specifically predicts that generative AI will spawn entirely new categories in software engineering and operations, alongside roles like machine learning specialists, automation architects, AI product managers, and the ethics and governance positions you mentioned.
What about the human AI collaboration angle? Because I keep hearing about hybrid teams where humans and AI systems work together rather than AI simply replacing human workers. And I'm curious whether that is actually playing out in practice.
Deloitte's latest research shows that workers actually prefer the hybrid model, where they combine AI tools with human interaction and judgment. And by 2027, half of companies using generative AI expect to deploy agentic AI applications that handle complex work with minimal human oversight.
That agentic AI deployment timeline is incredibly aggressive when you think about it, because we are talking about AI systems that can operate semi-autonomously on complex tasks within just the next year or so. And that has huge implications for how teams are structured.
It does, and it also connects to one of the more counterintuitive findings in the research, which is that Gartner predicts 50% of organizations will require what they call AI-free skills assessments by the end of 2026 because of growing concerns about critical thinking atrophy.
Wait, so companies are simultaneously deploying more AI while also worrying that their workers are losing critical thinking skills because of AI. And that seems like a really significant tension that organizations are going to have to navigate very carefully.
It is exactly that kind of paradox that makes this moment so challenging, because you need workers who can leverage AI effectively, but who also maintain the independent judgment and analytical capabilities that AI cannot fully replicate. At least not yet.
Let us talk about the regulatory dimension of all this, because the EU AI Act has classified workplace AI uses like recruitment and performance evaluation as high risk, and that is going to put significant compliance obligations on companies operating in Europe.
The EU approach is really comprehensive, and it requires transparency about how AI systems make employment decisions, mandates human oversight in hiring and performance management, and even banned the use of emotion recognition technology in workplaces starting back in February 2025.
The emotion recognition ban is interesting because it shows where regulators are drawing lines around AI in the workplace. And I wonder whether we will see similar restrictions in the United States, given the current federal push to preempt state-level AI regulations.
That is a great question, and the tension between federal and state approaches to AI regulation is creating real uncertainty for employers. Because some states have passed aggressive AI transparency and accountability laws, while the White House framework recommends preempting what it calls unduly burdensome state requirements.
So companies are navigating a patchwork of regulations while simultaneously trying to transform their workforces, which adds another layer of complexity to what is already an incredibly challenging organizational transformation for most businesses.
Exactly, and the HR leaders are right in the middle of it, because Gartner reports that 1 in 2 HR leaders have already deployed generative AI in their functions, but the data also shows that initial highly touted Gen AI tools often underperform expectations in practice.
That underperformance gap between AI hype and AI reality is something we talk about a lot on this show. And it is particularly relevant in the workforce context because overpromising on AI capabilities can lead to poorly planned layoffs and restructuring decisions.
That is such an important point, because if a company eliminates positions based on the assumption that AI can handle those tasks, and then discovers the AI is not quite ready, you end up with both reduced capability and damaged employee trust that is very difficult to rebuild.
So where does all of this leave us as we look ahead through the rest of 2026? Because it seems like we are at an inflection point where the decisions companies and governments make in the next few months could shape the workforce landscape for years to come.
I think the data tells us 3 things very clearly. And the first is that the transformation is happening faster than most predictions suggested, with 345,000 jobs lost in a single quarter from profitable companies actively choosing automation over human labor.
And the second takeaway from your perspective would be what? Because I imagine it has something to do with the opportunity side of this equation, given the net positive job creation numbers we discussed earlier in the conversation.
The second is that the opportunity is real, but unevenly distributed. And unless companies, governments, and educational institutions make aggressive investments in reskilling programs that specifically target the most vulnerable populations, including the 86% female demographic, we risk creating a deeply divided workforce.
That is a really powerful framing. And I think the third takeaway probably connects to the urgency of action, because 120 million workers needing reskilling is not a problem that solves itself over time without deliberate and sustained intervention.
Precisely. And the third takeaway is that individual workers cannot afford to wait for institutions to catch up, because the 56% wage premium for AI skills is a clear market signal that learning to work with AI is not optional anymore. It is becoming a fundamental requirement for economic participation.
That is a sobering but ultimately empowering message to end on, because it puts agency back in the hands of individual workers while also making clear that systemic support is absolutely necessary to make this transition equitable and sustainable for everyone.
And I would add that the companies who get this right, who invest in their people while thoughtfully deploying AI, are going to have an enormous competitive advantage over those who simply cut headcount and hope the technology fills the gap, because history shows that approach rarely works out well.
That's all for today's episode of the DX Today podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.